Hi, my name is Kate Malberger, and today I'd like to demonstrate for you an easy way to do piped binding. I've had some requests in some of my classes to have a demonstration on video. For this technique, it's very simple and it looks great. It adds a whole new design element to your quilt. I just finished a heart wall hanging for Valentine's Day, and I'm thinking this might be a good project to show you. I'll show you the quilt and then we'll get started. Before I show you the quilt that I'm going to demo on today, I wanted to show you some finished samples of quilts that I have already used this pipe binding technique on. In this particular one, you can see the binding, the main binding is a dark green fabric, and then the accent color is pink. And it just adds a nice little touch to the overall look of the quilt. The second one is this yellow one, and in this case I just added an accent fabric of the white that I used in the quilt. And then of course the main binding fabric is a pale yellow. So that's the look that you're going to get from doing this easy technique. Here then is the quilt that I'm going to work on today. And as you can see, I just have my raw edges all squared up and trimmed nicely. So I am ready to start binding this. Okay, I have selected the fabrics that I would like to use for my binding. I will be using this red fabric for the accent fabric, and that this tannish brown will be the main body of my binding. You need to cut enough strips to go around the entire outside edge of the quilt, just like you would for a normal binding. And then what the important part when doing two different colors like this is the measurements you need for these two. Normally you would cut your binding for a double fold binding, which is what we're doing. You would cut your binding 2.5 inches or so. The main body of the binding is, the measurement is 1.5 inch strips. The accent color is actually a little larger at 1 3/4 inch strips. You're going to then sew your strips together end to end, and then so that you'll have one long strip that will go all the way around. Once you have these two long strips, you're going to go ahead and put those right sides together and sew those together the whole length of this long strip. I'm going to go do that now. Okay, I have sewn the two strips together and the two long, very long strips together, 1/4 inch seam, and it's pretty important that you keep this at a consistent 1/4 inch seam so that it's even when we press this. And that's your next decision. When you open this up and press it, do you want to press toward the accent fabric or toward the brown? And I'm going to show you my, go back to my two samples to show you the difference of what you will get. On the pink and green one, I have pressed the seam toward the main green fabric, and that gives me a flatter look on that accent fabric. I tend to do this when I know I want to hand sew that binding down. It's a little easier when that pink is flat. On this one, I pressed the seam toward the white accent fabric, and it actually looks like there's a little bit, might be a little bit of piping in there. It just gives it that more of a 3D effect. So that's your choice. You can press toward the accent fabric or press toward the main fabric, and those are the two looks you're going to get. In this case today, I'm going to be pressing toward the accent fabric, so the red, so that I get more of a piped binding look. So I'll press that, and then I think I will also go ahead, once that seam has been pressed, then you're going to take the whole strip and press it wrong sides together like that. And I'll go ahead and do that too. right. I have pressed the entire strip, and the seam has been pressed toward the red accent fabric. I did the entire length. Then I went back and pressed these strips wrong sides together and lining up the raw edges very carefully, and then you'll see that will give me that little ridge of red. Not sure how well that's showing up here. Let me get a little closer so you can see that. There we go. There's a little ridge of red. Pressing is very important at this stage. And as I said, I did the entire length of the strip. So now I'm ready to take this binding piece to the sewing machine and sew it onto the back of the quilt. I'll see you at the machine. I've decided I'm going to put a couple of pins in this before I actually go to the sewing machine. And the way I like to do double fold binding is I like to leave about 12-inch tail free so that when I come around the other side I can join up very easily. So first thing I want to do is make sure I'm working on the back of the quilt, and I'm going to put the strip right side down, raw edges even, onto the back of the quilt, lining up all of those edges. I'm going to leave this flap about 12 inches free, and I'm just going to put a pin in to hold all of those raw edges together. I'm going to make sure that both edges of the binding are even with the edges of the quilt. And we can pin coming all the way down to this corner, but then we'll have to stop because I'm sure you're familiar with the way that binding, double fold binding is done, but I'll do this part on the machine, this one corner, just so you can see in case you're not familiar with it. I'll do it quickly so that we can move on from there. So I'm going to start sewing about right here, and I'm going to sew all the way down to within 1/4 inch of this corner, and I'll show you then how to proceed after that. Okay, I'm ready to sew the binding on. As you can see, I still have my 12-inch tail free here. I like to sew with the walking foot. When I do my binding, you are sewing through the thickness of a quilt, so I find the walking foot does a good job. I'm going to use a 3/0 stitch, and I'm going to pull out the pin where I want to start and go ahead and sew. Whoops, well, let me get my machine set up here for walking foot. Okay. I'm just going to go ahead and sew 1/4 inch seam all the way down to the corner, and then I'll be taking, when I do this, I always take my pins out. I don't like sewing over them when I'm attaching a binding. Okay, and as I said, I'm going to stop when I get within 1/4 inch. You can take the time, excuse me, this is bulking up here. You can take the time to mark that spot. I usually just eyeball it and stop and go backwards a couple of stitches when I think I've gotten there to the 1/4 inch. This will be important for the next step. Take it completely out of the machine, cutting the threads, and then we're going to turn and get ready for this next corner. And this is just a simple matter of flipping your binding straight up in the air, making this a straight edge right down through here, and then making sure these edges are even, of course, and then folding it back on itself right there at that original edge. And then we're ready to pin and sew the second side and the third and the fourth. I will go ahead and do that and then show you how I join the ends when we get all the way around. Okay, I have finished sewing my binding on all four corners, and I've left nice long tails free at the end so I can do the next step, and that is to join these and have them look as nice as the rest of the binding. So the first thing I want to do is just put a pin in the middle somewhere. It does not have to be exact. Just I've used one with a bigger pinhead so that hopefully you can see that. Then I'm going to take my left-hand side binding and I'm going to lay it on top of that pin and put another pin in just the top layer of that binding so that I can put it up here and open it up just like that with that pin marked on top of where this pin is. Then I'm going to take the one on the right hand side and lay it on top of that pin, putting another pin in on top just in that red layer. And then I'm going to open it up, bring the side of the quilt over so that I can open it up and lay it right on top of, I hope you're seeing this okay, the original binding strip, so that those pins meet, making a right angle, just like that. I think you can see that. And then with a ruler, I'm using a Sharpie. Wouldn't typically do this, but I want to make sure you can see the line that I'm drawing here. I'm going to go from where those pins intersect over here to where the other side where the strips intersect. And I'm going to draw a sewing line on there so that I know what I need to sew to get these to match up exactly. Move the ruler, and now I can actually put pins in. The other thing I do with this piped binding is I like to peel that back and just make sure that is going to match up right where that line is. If I put my fingernail on there, it looks like a pretty good match. And then I'll put pins in here so that I can sew right on that line to get my angle for the binding. I'll take that to the machine and we'll sew that up. Okay, I'm back at the machine. I have my marked diagonal line, sewing line. I can take these original two pins out now. They've done their job. And now I can go ahead and sew on this line. I should have mentioned this earlier, but there are many ways to join these binding strips and have them look nice. This is the way I learned years ago, so I'm too stubborn to learn something new. So this works for me, but you can certainly do this step any way that works for you. I'm just going to stick this under the machine, and I still have my walking foot on. That's okay. I'll just sew with that on right along that angled line. Cut my threads. Should have paid a little better attention to that seam. It flipped on me. Then just to double check to make sure we're in business, I like to open it up and make sure that's going to be a nice snug fit for my binding. It looks great. Then I can go ahead and trim off the rest of these tails. I'll hit it with the iron and then I will finish sewing that down. All right, I finished sewing down the open end. I did take it to the iron and lightly pressed the binding out to the outside edge like this so that when we flip it over, it is a little easier now to fold that edge down. Oh, I just love that look. I'm going to go ahead and sew this down by stitching in the ditch between the red and the tan fabric, and then do this all by machine rather than by hand. When you get to the corners, you're going to have to gently fold that in. Let me get a little closer here. And then fold the other one, the next corner over, so you have your mitered corner look. You want to make sure that you have the right thread color for this. For the top, I will want to put a tan thread in there. And for back here, I think I'm going to go with the cream, because typically I'll be sewing on that white background fabric with the bobbin thread. So I'm going to go ahead and change thread colors and sew this down, and we'll take a look when it's done. Another thing I'd like to mention as I'm coming along here and sewing down the binding onto the front of the quilt, it is a little cumbersome for your foot to ride atop that ridge, because it is thick like a piping would be. And instead of putting a zipper foot on there, I usually bump my needle to the right 2 or 3 positions. I have it set on a number 3 right now, and that way this ridge falls right between the 2 sides of the walking foot and nests right, the needle nests right up next to it. So that might help. So here you have it. I believe this is a pretty impressive finish, and it's pretty easy. So go ahead and check that out. Another project finish, and it's done in time for Valentine's Day. So I'll be hanging this one up. I hope you have a chance to try this on your next project, and I hope you love it as much as I do.